and welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at how I took this cheap floor tom and converted it into a nesting bass drum. So I was recently scrolling through Facebook Marketplace where I found a listing for an entire drum kit for $25. Although these drums were pretty beat up and seemed to be of the cheapest variety, I quickly got in touch with the seller to come by and pick them up. I figured for $25 I could very easily get my money back or try to DIY these into some other kinds of drums that would be something more useful for myself. I knew the first project I'd want to try is converting the 16-inch floor tom into a bass drum, but after talking to a friend, he suggested I try to build a nesting bass drum. I've been a big fan of nesting drums for a long time, and honestly I've never had the chance to see one in person. The concept is pretty simple. Basically, you split the shell in half to create a space where you can open up the drum without having to remove the heads. The reason for this opening is to store other smaller drums inside of that drum, like a Russian nesting doll. This seemed to be a popular solution for big city drummers who may be hauling drums on a taxi or on the subway. But as an avid consumer of travel-friendly drums, I jumped at the opportunity to try this myself. My first step was to remove all the rims, heads, lugs, and brackets attached to the shell. After I got into these drums, I ended up deciding to give the hardware a bath in some WD-40 in an attempt to remove some of the rust on the hardware. After stripping the shell, I took a heat gun to the wrap seam and loosened up the adhesive to the point where I could pull it off the shell. With these cheap drums, you never quite know what you're going to get under the wrap, and a lot of times the wrap is there to cover up poor grain and appearance of the wood. Mine ended up being okay, but I definitely needed to sand the shell in order to try and get a decent looking and feeling wood surface. Next up was prepping the shell for stain. Although this drum has bearing edges that are less than perfect, I didn't want anything I did to mess with them. So I taped up the edges along with the mounting holes to avoid any stain getting in the shell or on the edges. I'm using this Minwax navy stain, which is left over from the shallow depth drum kit I built earlier this year. I might have preferred a different finish, but I'm sitting on nearly a full can of this, so this drum's getting the same treatment. I did one coat of stain, and then went back and touched it up where I had voids. Even after sanding this drum shell, it still has a lot of small divots and imperfections. This made it pretty tricky to apply a nice even coat. I opted out of doing any sort of top coat like a polyurethane or high gloss finish, because I simply don't feel like giving 6 to 8 coats for a drum that I think has limited potential visually. While waiting for the stain to dry, I took one of the provided drum heads and decided to try making a resonant head for the kick drum. Since I didn't want the look of a clear head, I wanted to see if I could spray paint the head and still get a decent finish. I taped up the collar of the head to avoid any issues coming up later with the seating of the drum head back on the shell. I used some standard black spray paint, and I ended up doing 2 coats. The finish is pretty durable. Considering the head won't be hit, I'm not too worried about it flaking or peeling off over time, and at the very least, I'm just using recycled materials included with this drum set. Getting back to the shell, my next step was to rip down the depth of the drum. This drum is a 16-inch depth, but I was hoping for more of an 11 to 12-inch depth. Typically when I do this, I'm trimming off a set amount from one end of the drum and then re-drilling holes for the lugs and cutting a new bearing edge. With this drum I realized I'd be able to cut out a segment from the middle of the shell, since in the end I'd have a cut right down the middle of the shell anyways. This ended up saving me a lot of time because I didn't have to drill any lug holes or cut any new bearing edges in the whole process. The next 2 steps in this process are probably the trickiest. The most unique part of a nesting drum is the way in which the 2 halves lock together. On a lot of these drums, I see a sort of lip across one of the exposed edges, allowing the 2 halves to get in place and then not slip out of alignment with each other. I figured if I could cut opposite-facing 45-degree angles on each half of the drum, it wouldn't be able to slip in either direction, much like the way a French cleat works. I used my router table to get this done, and after some test cuts, it was a decent locking fit between the 2 halves. The second of these harder steps was installing the latches. I bought these spring-loaded latches off of Amazon, and I basically searched around until I found something that looked similar to what I've seen on other nesting drums. I think the most important part of this is finding a spring-loaded latch so that you have tension when you bring the 2 pieces together. It took a few tries to figure out the sweet spot on how to space these latches, but once I did, it's just a matter of repeating the layout, drilling holes, and installing each latch. At this point in the process, I also realized how I underestimated the placement of these. I never noticed until this point that the drum I was working with had 5 lugs. Such an odd lug pattern for a 16-inch floor tom, but I guess when you're working with the most entry-level drums, they are saving on materials wherever they can. With 5 lugs, 3 floor tom legs, and 3 latches, it's a little uneven layout, but I made it work. With the latch system in place, it was time to assemble the drum back together. I learned how cheap these drums are once again when I reattached these lugs and they continually snapped at the threading. But luckily I have plenty of spares from the rack toms that came with this kit. I already owned a 16-inch super kick and a bass drum riser from over the years, and I went on eBay and found these 2 bass drum hoops for $20 shipped. I robbed the bass drum claws from the kick that came with this kit and used some legs that I had that luckily fit into the floor tom brackets. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the experiment of trying to build this nesting drum. It sounds fine and it works functionally. It could look a little better, but I'd be the first to admit that the more I worked with these components from this drum, the less and less I was inspired to take my time on making it as best as I could. The nesting feature works, and if you were so inclined, you could even build a floor tom and a rack tom that would fit inside this drum. I was able to get a 13-inch tom inside this bass drum, and then if you have a discreet enough tom arm, you can even fit a 10-inch rack tom inside that 13. If you happen to have one of the Ludwig breakbeat kits lying around, it might be possible to turn it into a nesting kit, but I'd be hesitant to try it myself with anything other than drums like this. I'm surprised more companies don't offer this, especially with all the emphasis on drums that are portable in today's market. I'd love to know what you think, so leave a comment down below and keep an eye out for future videos where I'll tackle repurposing some of the other drums from this kit. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to my channel and liking this video. Thanks for watching.